Support for Arkansas Week provided by the Arkansas Democrat-Gazette, the Arkansas Times, and KUAR-FM 89.
And hello again, everyone. Thanks very much for joining us. We're midway in the first month of the first quarter of a new calendar year, third quarter of the state's fiscal year. And judging by the state treasury, it's almost as if nothing unusual had happened in the previous 10 or 11 months. Almost. But if you're self-employed or you run a small business or you rely on one, your take may be rather different. The Arkansas economy in the near future, that's our focus in this half hour. And we're joined in this edition by Tab Townsell, Executive Director of Metroplan, the Central Arkansas Planning Agency, Dr. Mervin Jebaraj of the University of Arkansas's Economic Research Center, and George Jarrett, the Northeast Arkansas Bureau Chief of Talk Business and Politics. Gentlemen, thank you all for coming in. Tab, let me go to you first, because in the latest edition of Metroplan's, your latest publication, Metro Trends, the focus, and I can't get close enough for the audience, but the focus is a number of individuals, all of whom wearing masks. Clearly, COVID is the focus anyway, and its impact on the economy is the focus of Metroplan, the Central Arkansas area, at least as you gentlemen see it, and ladies see it.
Absolutely. It is, that's the theme of the Metro Trends magazine for this year, because you can't talk about this year in the economy without recognizing the impact of the pandemic throughout Arkansas. You know, it's not only just our Central Arkansas area and our MPO, but throughout the state's economy as well.
Right. Well, is there a segment of the Central Arkansas? Obviously, hospitality has taken it absolutely on the nose, but other aspects of the economy, certainly with focus on the Central Arkansas.
Our statistics show that it's dramatically affected some sectors and not affected other sectors at all. As a matter of fact, some other sectors are booming, particularly other niches, industries in the total economy. Leisure and hospitality has taken it, a dramatic hit. Our numbers that we published were over 11,000 jobs in our region, down over 10% of the workforce, and that probably fluctuates depending on where the what the restrictions are at that given time. That's dramatic. Same way with education and medical. They're for some reason lumped together in our statistics. It's gone down over 6,000 jobs, taking a pretty dramatic hit, as well as other categories as well. But if you look at grocery stores and general merchandising stores, it's done very well. Construction has continued very well, and of course, e-commerce is taking a multi-double-digit leap forward. So,
yeah. Let me go to George Jarrett now and let's give us an update on Northeast Arkansas.
Yes, Steve. In Northeast Arkansas, the primary economic driver in this region is agriculture. We've been in kind of a depressed state the last couple of years, pre-COVID, just because, Arkansas is a top soybean producer. And, the trade war with China especially had really hampered the soybean markets. I talked to Arkansas Agriculture Secretary Wes Ward recently, and he told me that they're pretty optimistic that this year that they're going to get some movement on that trade dispute. And he thinks that actually soybean acres may rise this year. We were pretty close to 3 million acres planted this year, and that may go up several thousand or several 100,000 acres this spring. We'll see what happens. Obviously rice and corn, some of those other crops we grow in this part of the state. The prices have been good, relatively speaking, compared to last year. So there's some optimism there. Obviously, in recent years, we started growing peanuts in this part of the state again. We had, I think, about 34,000 acres this year, which is about 1,000 acres more. And from everything I'm hearing right now, those acres will probably continue to increase as time goes on. Jonesboro, which is kind of the hub of this part of the state, is kind of an island. It's very isolated from other parts of the state. It's also isolated from economic trends to a degree. A lot of the manufacturing base up here is food processing.
Right.
We have a lot of government jobs, a lot of hospital jobs. So, even in times of recession or economic downturn, our unemployment rate in this part of the state doesn't typically go down as much. So things are somewhat humming along. I know I've talked to several restaurant owners and some small business people who are definitely suffering right now. I saw a statistic, the other day that, up to 1 in 3 restaurants nationwide could shut down if this continues on through the next year. And I can see some of that trend line precipitating through this part of the state as well. So I think it is a problem for sure.
Well, let me stick with you, George, just for a second and stick with ag. So much of that is going to hinge on trade policy, correct?
Yes. And, we talked about last year we signed that the preliminary stage or stage 1 of this new trade agreement with China. They agreed recently to buy, I believe, $4.8 billion worth of our ag products, which is a good step. Now, I will say this, in the past, the Chinese have made promises, especially in the ag sector, that they haven't kept. For years, Steve, that we've talked about the Chinese don't buy a lot of international rice, especially from us. And there's always been optimism for years that they're going to buy. And we seem to reach these preliminary agreements with them to buy Arkansas rice, and it never seems to come to fruition. And so we'll see how this goes. There's also something that Wes and I talked a lot about are, with the new administration coming in, there's going to be a new ag secretary. Secretary Vilsack will come back and take that role. So we'll see we'll see how how this trade war opens up. This part of Arkansas is also unique in another sense because, another major industry up here is steel. And one side effect of this trade war has been the rise of American steel on international markets, and that has been a boon to the steel companies up in this area. I'm sure you're familiar with Nucor and Big River Steel, which is now owned by U.S. Steel. And so we're in a unique position where we have one of our major industries is doing pretty well because of the trade war, and then we've got another part of our economic sector that's doing poorly because of the fact that the Chinese are just not buying as many soybeans, or they're using secondary markets to get our soybeans, which is still driving prices down.
Yeah, Tab, Mervin, well, let's go to Mervin first. The shift, we had an election in November. We're about to get a new administration. So with a new cast of characters, that could change the situation rather significantly and fairly quickly, one would think.
Yeah, I think, we saw expectations from economists across the country switch with the, finalization of the Georgia runoff elections. I think before that, people were expecting divided government, so the Senate was going to be in Republican hands and the administration and the House were going to be in Democratic hands. And I think at that point, prospects for additional stimulus, additional funds to businesses or to households were slim. We were going to be stuck with whatever we had, the $900 billion at the end of December. I think very quickly after that election was finalized a couple of days ago, you saw most economists up their expectations for GDP growth immediately, assuming, of course, that the new democratically controlled Senate would go along with the administration and the House in providing additional stimulus. What form that takes, we'll have to wait and see, but I think there's a huge menu of items that they could choose from, which include additional direct payments to households, whether or not that's tied to vaccination or not, additional unemployment benefits, which run out in 10 weeks, the one that passed at the end of December, and then additional PPP loans, which, again, don't last very long and will need to be re-upped here soon.
Yeah, even with the change in administration and control of the Senate, and by the way, control of the Senate obviously is a very, very, very narrow margin, no margin for error there, but just the psychology of the change in administrations. Are we likely to see a significant, through this quarter anyway, a significant bump?
I certainly think that it will last this quarter and certainly longer time period than then too, because most of the money that's going to go out this quarter is going to be part of what happened in that $900 billion stimulus package that was passed at the end of December. So depending on how quickly, there's been a lot of talk about $2,000 checks to individuals, depending on how quickly that goes in, will determine how much more we see this quarter versus later quarters this year. But I think it's far more important to try to figure out how to get money to households that are unemployed and to businesses that are currently shuttered or struggling to pay rent and utilities and those types of expenses.
Right, and Tab Townsell, local governments looking longingly, fervently at Washington, urgently to Washington for some assistance.
Well, actually, strangely, the retail sales and the sales tax revenues this past year have actually been generally higher to most local governments, even though it's not been as much of a boon at all to Little Rock and North Little Rock. The surrounding areas have seen quite large and healthy spikes in their sales tax collections, but you never know. Our numbers don't show yet the running out of unemployment benefits or the shutting down of more of the economy as this late fall surge has overtaken us more. So it's hard to tell. There's a lot of uncertainty. A lot of people didn't budget any growth in their local governments, didn't budget any growth just because of that uncertainty. So yes, they are, but they're probably not as desperate for it as other sectors or perhaps other state and local governments around the nation.
Well, in terms of individual assistance.
Right. Individual assistance, that's certainly one of those things that they are after because that does sustain. And I think our numbers tracking through the middle part of the year do show that there's a strong probability that those enhanced retail sales are coming because of the sustained unemployment benefits and the direct checks to families and households. So in that sense, they're very interested in what goes in to the households in their cities in terms of direct payments to the governments themselves to sustain lost revenues. They're not as concerned about that, but there is a lot of uncertainty still.
Yeah, let me go back to Mervin for just a second. Talking about the Northwest quadrant there and the enormous growth, Mervin, is there a point of particular concern, even though things are looking still pretty dandy up there?
Yeah, I mean, if you just look at the headline indicators, it might look like nothing's particularly wrong. I mean, our unemployment rate is about 2% higher than it used to be before this pandemic started. But it's 2 or 3% lower than the peak unemployment that we reached in April and May. So if you're just looking at those particular perspectives, it might seem like nothing's wrong. Our major employers are doing fine. But the leisure and hospitality industry here, just like Tab mentioned in Central Arkansas, has been particularly hard hit. I mean, you're looking at 1 in 5 businesses, or in some cases about a fourth of small businesses in that particular sector are still closed. You're looking at their employees that might be permanently unemployed and those businesses that might be permanently closed. So there's still a lot more room for us to get additional stimulus to try to figure out if those businesses are viable and can be reopened in the near future. I think that's what we're going to look to see if the new stimulus bills provide. And, so far, I mean, the state has sales tax information up until October, so it doesn't give us enough of a timeline. But if you're looking at national stats on retail sales, we've had a very poor Christmas shopping season. So we could expect to see some of the similar things here in Arkansas. And so sales tax revenues might be down based on that. And the other piece is, you're seeing state and local governments cut jobs, both in schools and city governments, in anticipation of slowness coming at some point in the future. And that's what we saw in the last recession. During the recession itself, Congress provided direct funds to states and cities, but right after the recession ended, they pulled those funds back when the economy was not quite going. So while other sectors of the economy were adding jobs, state and local governments were cutting jobs, and that kind of dragged the overall economy and employment picture down as well. So there's still quite a bit that needs to be done for state and local governments and for leisure and hospitality businesses.
Yeah, and some of the numbers coming out of Washington at the end of the first week anyway of the new year weren't terribly bright, weren't terribly encouraging.
Yeah, we saw nearly 500,000 jobs lost in the leisure, particularly in restaurants alone. So that's fairly significant. That should have been a good month, in any normal year. That would have been a good month in December for those businesses. And so that was a huge hit to that sector. And that's what we would expect to see given You see the high case rates here in Arkansas as well as the rest of the country, so people are a lot less comfortable going into restaurants and bars and those types of businesses where you're going to have to remove your mask and be in a close space with other people for an extended period of time.
Right. George, in the Northeast and in the Delta as a whole, in addition to ag policy, what are you going to be looking at for the next, say, next 2 quarters anyway?
Well, Steve, as you know, here in Northeast Arkansas, we've had exponential sales tax growth, especially in Jonesboro and Craighead County. We set an all-time record for sales tax collection in 2020, despite the pandemic. So kind of what I'll be looking at, the first and second quarters to see if those sales tax numbers continue to increase. Basically, over the last 10 years, those numbers we've set an all-time record almost every year. So you could almost set your watch to it. The thing about Northeast Arkansas is kind of there's 2 sides to this coin. The city of Jonesboro and Craighead County and Paragould and some of the cities around Jonesboro are doing pretty well. There's population growth. There's sales tax growth. The unemployment numbers are relatively low. But what's happening in other parts of the Arkansas Delta is a depopulation. And so as these communities depopulate, it erodes their sales tax growth. And obviously the other things that come with that are a loss of jobs, a loss of economic opportunity. So it turns into a snowball. So a snowball effect. So what's happening in Jonesboro is positive, but what's happening in many other parts of the Delta is a lot of these smaller communities are starting to die and dry up from a lack of economic activity. I will say this, kind of reading some of the tea leaves into the future. We've been in a deep recession here for quite some time. And, looking into the future, we do a lot of food manufacturing, food processing here. And kind of, the rule of thumb is that when the economy slows down or goes into a downturn, is people stop eating out as much and they start eating, they go to the grocery store more. And so Nestle announced recently that they were going to invest $100 million at their facility in Jonesboro to expand their Hot Pocket lines. And while that seems like it seems like just a everyday story, it tells me that they're getting ready. They're getting ready for an economic downturn, a significant economic downturn that may last a while, because people have to eat. That's the bottom line. And so if they're not eating out, they're going to be going to the grocery store and buying more. Hot Pockets are kind of a cheap food item. And so it looks like if you read some of the tea leaves out there, we could be in for a very prolonged economic downturn.
Well, Tab, you have written about this and lectured on this extensively, and I know, Mervin, you have as well, and it's something that George just touched on. That Jonesboro Paragould SMSA is just booming. It's just doing dandy. Elsewhere in the 1st Congressional District, East Arkansas, it's losing population, and South Arkansas, the same is true, with the exception maybe of a couple of areas there, a couple of more. And the social implications and the tax and governmental implications are really profound.
Very profound. Basically, the impression I got was listening to the anecdotal evidence of talking to people, talking to the colleges, talking to the people who were being recruited into industries, is that the growth of the Conway area, back when I was mayor of Conway, and it seems like it's replicated around our region as well, of the growing cities, suburban and urban, is that they're coming from the depopulation of the rest of the state. And while it's a boon to those cities, it's a detriment to those areas. And we being such a sales tax driven, local community, looking at city of Conway, it was about 60% of all the revenue that was available to the city of Conway was collected through sales tax. And if you don't have the populations, you're not going to sustain the businesses to collect the sales taxes, and you get into that spiral George was talking about. So it is devastating. And until economies come back, until people come back into many of those areas, and what drives that, I'm not sure, then it is going to be a depressing tale continuing through those areas. I mean, George is exactly right with that.
Mervin, everyone knows that Amazon is building this mammoth facility in central Arkansas, and who surely, quite likely, it may not be the last of its type. And of course, I'm getting at e-commerce, which is shape shifting at warp speed. the nature of commerce around the world, but certainly in Arkansas.
I think so, very much. Initially in the pandemic, people didn't have an idea of how long this would persist, and so people were participating in e-commerce at greater levels than they have ever done before. And if we'd had a very short pandemic period, maybe it would have gone back to some of the older behaviors. But now it's very soon going to be a year now since the initial shutdowns and closures and stuff like that people started doing more online shopping from. And they've kept up that pace this entire time. So it's unlikely at this point that we will see a complete return to some of those bricks and mortar type places. Now, the one thing the state was lucky in doing was that right before the pandemic, not right before the pandemic, but in the year before the pandemic happened, we'd started collecting sales taxes on online sales as well, especially from bigger retailers like Amazon. And so that has helped the cities across Arkansas tide over some of those issues while people are buying goods online. But when we talk about future taxes that they would collect from sales taxes, there's a lot of behavior that happened specifically because of the pandemic. So initially, early on, people got money, large checks that they went out and spent on making their homes nicer because they're spending a longer period of time at home. It's not entirely clear what people are going to do with additional money at this point because, when you buy furniture like that, you're typically going to keep that for a period of time. So additional money is not necessarily immediately going to translate into additional goods services, especially when the service side of the economy is not likely to see additional customers until enough of the population has been vaccinated.
Right, and also in addition to brick and mortar retail, you have brick and mortar office space, hundreds of thousands of square feet, not to mention parking lots that have been for much of the last 10 months idle or comparatively idle. Tab Townsell, you concerned about whether we're going to see, what are we going to do with that space? Will there be a return to office work as we have known
I think that's one of those long lag impacts that we don't know. But there is the strong possibility that indeed you'll see the rentals, the property worth go down, the rental prices go down, vacancies where we really don't need vacancies. So that is a critical issue that we want to watch because it does churn in through the economy throughout our metropolitan areas. And so yes. We don't know. That's a huge question mark. But my guess is, as Mervin was saying, there are some aspects of this genie that's never going to fit quite back in that bottle before the pandemic, and that may be one of them to dramatic effects, say downtown Little Rock, and the major rental property and office spaces around our state.
Yeah, including that Jonesboro SMSA. George?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I talked to Mr. Kopis, the CEO over at Nabholz recently, and he told me his feeling is that a lot of this, especially this office type space, is going to go away. A lot of, especially for professionals, like attorneys, CPAs, whatever, they've figured out that they can work from home. It's cheaper. They don't have to pay for that space. And so there's going to be a rearrangement of the way, like commercial properties, that sector of the economy. He told me, though, that he thought that there was some hope for some growth. He said that, like warehouse space, if people are ordering more things from Amazon or online, they still have to get those items. So there'll have to be an infrastructure built to accommodate that type of those types of items being taken to people's houses. So warehouse space will probably be on the rise. Entertainment venues, once we get through the COVID-19 pandemic, probably there's going to be a surge of people who want to be entertained, do these things. Go to concerts, go listen to people playing music, go to theater, stuff like that. So venues like that there'll probably be a high need for that. Kind of in this part of the state too, I will mention this, we're in close proximity to Memphis. And so there's been a lot of, they've spent well over $100 million developing the downtown in Memphis, and that kind of has a bleed-off effect into the Delta, as far as creating jobs and creating opportunities, entertainment opportunities and stuff like that. So, the feeling was before the pandemic hit was that there was going to be kind of a revitalization of downtown Memphis, which would actually help to revitalize, the Delta region. And so a lot of those projects are still ongoing, but until we're able to go back to full capacity, we won't know what those impacts will be from an economic perspective.
Okay. Mervin, I'm going to give you the last word here. The legislature is sitting now, writing a budget. If you could give the legislature and the executive as some advice in 15 words or less regarding a budget for the fiscal year, what would it be?
I think we need direct grants and support to small businesses, especially in the leisure and hospitality sector, that have had imposed on them capacity restrictions or curfews or things like that. So, for the long-term sales tax future of the city, of cities, and for the state, people are going to stop shopping as much in grocery stores eventually when this pandemic is past, but they won't have restaurants and bars to go to if we don't make sure that those restaurants and bars make it through this pandemic.
Got to end it there because, gentlemen, we are simply out of time. We thank you for yours. Thanks for being a part of the program.
Thank you.
And come back soon. Thank you, as always, for watching. See you next week.
Support for Arkansas Week provided by the Arkansas Democrat-Gazette, the Arkansas Times, and KUAR-FM 89.